The small apartment smelled of damp wood and unwashed clothes. The single lamp in the corner flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Victoria sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, holding a crumpled eviction notice in her trembling hands. The rain outside lashed against the glass, drowning out the city noise. She wasn't crying. She had already spent hours sobbing into her hands. Her eyes, once bright with dreams, were now red and empty. The weight of her reality pressed down on her like an iron fist. She was alone, abandoned, and 3 months pregnant. Elias had left without a second thought. One moment, they were talking about the future, about dreams and possibilities. The next, he was gone, his words cold and final. "I can't do this, Victoria. You'll be fine." And just like that, he had disappeared into a world of luxury and ambition, leaving her to fend for herself with nothing but unpaid bills and a life growing inside her. A sharp gust of wind slipped through the cracked window, making her shiver. She glanced at the pile of unpaid rent statements on the counter, her mind racing. She had nothing, no job, no family to run to, no safety net. The world outside did not care about a young woman with a broken heart and a baby on the way. Her fingers curled around the paper in her lap. She could give up, pack a small bag and disappear into the same darkness that had swallowed her once perfect life. But then she pressed a hand against her stomach, a heartbeat, a reminder that she wasn't alone. No, she would not disappear. Victoria wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn sweater and pushed herself up from the floor. She looked around the tiny space that had once been her home, but now felt like a prison. This wasn't where her story would end. She would find a way. The first few months were the hardest. She took whatever job she could find, cleaning offices late at night, waiting tables at a rundown diner, taking shifts at a laundromat. She learned to survive on instant noodles and coffee, her body growing weaker as the pregnancy advanced. There were nights when exhaustion won, and she collapsed on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake by choosing to fight. But then she felt the soft flutter of movement inside her belly, and she knew there was no turning back. By the time Leonardo was born, Victoria had already transformed herself. She had learned the language of survival, understood the brutal laws of the world. The moment she held him in her arms, all the pain, the humiliation, the hunger, it all disappeared. She was no longer the girl Elias had abandoned. She was a mother, and she would be unstoppable. The years passed in a blur of sacrifice and determination. Victoria worked tirelessly, climbing the ranks in the world of finance. She studied at night, worked during the day, and built a name for herself. Every deal, every investment, every success was another brick in the empire she was creating. Not for revenge, not for him, but for Leonardo. The boy grew up watching his mother fight for their future. At 16, he was sharp, composed, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the world owed him nothing. He admired Victoria more than anyone, understanding that every privilege he had now was a direct result of her resilience. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of their high-rise apartment, he looked at her and said, "One day, I'll make you as proud of me as I am of you." Victoria smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. She had already won. But fate had other plans. A prestigious invitation arrived, a charity gala filled with the elite, the kind of people Victoria now belonged among. She wasn't one for extravagant events, but this one caught her attention. The host's name was familiar. Elias Davenport. For the first time in years, Victoria hesitated. She had built a life where his name no longer mattered. He was nothing but a ghost from a past she had buried. But as she stared at the invitation, she felt something stir inside her. Not anger, not hatred, a realization. She had spent so many years proving to herself that she didn't need him, that she was more than the girl he left behind. But maybe, just maybe, He needed to see it too. Victoria placed the invitation on the table, looking over at Leonardo. "Would you like to accompany me to an event?" she asked, her voice light, but her mind already made up. He raised an eyebrow. "A gala? That's not really my thing." She smirked. "It will be worth it." Leonardo shrugged, unaware of the history tied to that simple piece of paper. But Victoria knew, and so did fate. The dress fit like a second skin. Deep emerald green, satin, with a slit that whispered elegance and power. Victoria stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the diamond earrings that shimmered against her skin. She was no longer the woman Elias had left behind. That girl had died in a dimly lit apartment, replaced by someone who had clawed her way to the top. The reflection staring back at her exuded control, wealth, and confidence. Yet, beneath the composed exterior, something stirred. Not nerves, not fear, something else. A quiet satisfaction at knowing the past was about to witness her present. Behind her, Leonardo lounged against the doorframe, effortlessly handsome in a tailored black suit. He smirked as he watched her. "I still don't get why this gala is so important to you." Victoria turned, offering him a knowing smile. "Because sometimes life gives you an opportunity to close a chapter properly." Leonardo straightened his cuffs. "And Elias Davenport is part of that chapter." She lifted a perfectly arched brow. "I never told you his name." "You didn't have to." He adjusted his tie. "I've done my research. I know everything about the man you refused to mention." A beat of silence passed between them. There was no anger in his voice, only curiosity. He had inherited her sharpness, her ability to see beyond the surface. Victoria sighed, walking over to him. "You need to understand something. This night isn't about him. It's about me, about us. I built a life for you, for myself, without him. Nothing he does tonight can change that." Leonardo studied her, then gave a slow nod. "All right then, let's go make history." The car ride to the gala was smooth, the city lights a blur beyond the tinted windows. Inside, Victoria remained poised, though her fingers traced the edge of her clutch absent-mindedly. Leonardo noticed but said nothing. As the vehicle pulled up to the grand entrance, cameras flashed in rapid succession. The moment Victoria stepped out, all eyes were on her. There was a murmur, a shift in the atmosphere as whispers spread among the elite. People who once ignored her, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a forgotten past, were now watching in stunned silence. Leonardo stepped out after her, offering his arm. She took it, not because she needed support, but because they were a team. Together, they walked up the marble steps, past gold-trimmed doors, into a world that once would have seemed unreachable. The ballroom was a masterpiece of luxury, chandeliers dripping with crystal, classical music floating through the air, tables adorned with white roses and silver cutlery. It was the kind of event where power was exchanged through glances, where alliances were formed with the clink of champagne glasses. Victoria's presence did not go unnoticed. The moment she entered, conversations faltered, people turned, and then him. Elias stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked almost the same, though the years had sculpted sharper edges into his face. His perfectly tailored suit, his watch that probably cost as much as a house, it was all meticulously crafted to maintain his image, but none of it prepared him for this moment. His grip on the glass tightened as his gaze locked onto her. It was as if time folded in on itself, dragging him back 25 years. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to reconcile the memory of the girl he had abandoned with the woman standing before him now. And then his eyes moved to Leonardo. The resemblance was undeniable, the same sharp features, the same piercing gaze. Elias paled. Victoria held his stare for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. then turned away as if he were nothing more than a stranger in the crowd. The past had finally caught up with him. Elias stood frozen. The ice in his whiskey melted, forgotten, as his fingers clenched around the glass. He had prepared himself for an evening of routine socializing, empty conversations, and strategic networking. What he had not prepared for, what he could not have prepared for, was her. Victoria. She moved through the crowd like she belonged there. No, not like she did belong there. Every graceful step, every measured glance, every perfectly timed smile was proof that she was no longer the girl he had left behind. Elias had always imagined her as nothing more than a memory, one he had conveniently buried under years of carefully curated success. In his mind, she had faded into obscurity, perhaps struggling, perhaps forgotten. But here she was, standing at the center of the most elite event of the season, wearing a dress that made heads turn and holding the arm of a young man who bore his features. His throat tightened. He forced himself to look away, to gather his thoughts, to regain control. Yet, the moment he attempted to steady himself, murmurs rippled through the ballroom. People were watching. They had noticed. Someone approached him, a business associate, perhaps a woman in an elegant navy gown. "Elias," she said, amusement lacing her voice. "I didn't know you and Victoria Reynolds were acquainted." Acquainted. The word felt insufficient, almost ridiculous. He managed a polite smile. "It was a long time ago." The woman's gaze flickered toward Victoria. "She's impressive. Didn't she just close that multi-million-dollar merger last month?" Elias barely heard her. His focus was elsewhere, on Victoria, who now stood near the bar, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. She had yet to look at him again. But then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, the noise around them faded. Victoria's expression did not falter. There was no anger, no resentment, just an unshakable confidence that sent a sharp pang of something unfamiliar through his chest. Then he spoke. "Victoria!" She tilted her head, studying him with the cool detachment of someone assessing a piece of art she had long outgrown. "Mr. Davenport. Mr. Davenport." The formality struck him harder than any insult could have. He cleared his throat, shifting his stance. "I didn't expect to see you here." She took a slow sip of champagne, unbothered. "That much is clear." Elias glanced at Leonardo, who stood at her side, silent but observant. There was a sharp intelligence in the young man's gaze, a quiet strength that made Elias uneasy. Finally, he spoke. "And you are—" Leonardo extended a hand, his smirk subtle but unmistakable. "Leonardo Reynolds." Elias hesitated. The last name echoed in his mind. Reynolds, not Davenport. Leonardo's grip was firm, steady, the kind of handshake that demanded respect. Elias forced himself to reciprocate. "A pleasure." Leonardo's smirk widened. "I imagine it must be." A challenge, subtle but undeniable. Elias looked between them, Victoria, poised and powerful, and Leonardo, a living testament to the years he had lost. A bitter realization settled over him. He had underestimated her. And now, it was too late. The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that no polite conversation could mask. Victoria remained poised, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of her champagne flute. Leonardo stood tall beside her, his sharp gaze fixed on Elias with an unreadable expression. Elias felt an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest. He had built his entire life around control over his empire, his reputation, his carefully curated world. But this was something he had no control over. Victoria had outgrown him, surpassed every expectation he had unknowingly placed upon her. And Leonardo, his son, though the young man didn't know it yet, was a stranger to him. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "So, Leonardo, what is it that you do?" Leonardo arched a brow, unimpressed. "I could list my credentials, but something tells me that's not what you really want to know." Elias exhaled slowly. "You're sharp." Leonardo smirked. "So I've been told." Victoria set her glass down with deliberate elegance. "Well, this has been an interesting exchange, but we really must continue making our rounds." Elias took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Victoria!" She turned, her expression unreadable. He hesitated. For years, he had convinced himself that walking away from her had been the right decision, that it had freed him to pursue the life he wanted. But now, standing in front of her, seeing what she had become, he realized something chilling. He had left her behind, thinking she would never reach his level, but she hadn't just reached it, she had surpassed it, and worse, she no longer cared about his existence. He struggled for words, his confidence shaken for the first time in years. "It's been a long time." Victoria tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Has it?" He swallowed hard. "I never expected to see you here." Her smile was slow, deliberate. "That much is clear." She turned to Leonardo, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. "Shall we?" Leonardo nodded, his smirk still in place. "By all means." And just like that, they walked away. Elias remained standing there, the weight of his past pressing against him like an iron grip. He had spent decades building his legacy, believing he had made all the right choices. But in the span of mere minutes, Victoria Reynolds had silently dismantled the illusion he had lived under for so long. And for the first time, Elias Davenport understood what it felt like to be left behind. Elias remained rooted in place long after Victoria and Leonardo disappeared into the glittering crowd. His grip on the whiskey glass tightened, jaw clenched as waves of bitter realization crashed over him. He had always thought of himself as a man who never looked back. But now, the past had returned, not as a ghost, but as a force more powerful than anything he had ever built. Victoria had moved on, without him, and Leonardo, his son. The thought sent a jolt of something sharp through him. A son he had never met. A son who didn't carry his last name. A son who had grown into a man without his presence. His guidance, his influence, the weight of it was suffocating. Elias turned toward the bar, downing the remainder of his drink in a single, burning gulp. He needed to think, needed to regain the control that had so effortlessly slipped from his grasp. But control meant nothing when the past refused to be ignored. Across the ballroom, Victoria felt the familiar burn of Elias's gaze on her back, but she didn't turn. She had won the moment she walked into this room. There was nothing more to prove. Yet as much as she told herself that she couldn't deny the small knot in her stomach, not of regret, she had long buried that, but of unspoken truths. Leonardo, oblivious to the storm raging within his mother, picked up a champagne flute from a passing waiter. "That went well," Victoria smirked. "Did it?" "I'd say so." He looked like a man watching his world crumble in real time. She exhaled slowly. "That world was never ours to begin with." Leonardo studied her, sensing something beneath her cool exterior. "You don't regret coming tonight, do you?" "No," she answered without hesitation, "but I do regret how long I let him exist in my mind." Leonardo raised his glass. "To closure, then." Victoria lifted hers in return, but before their glasses met, a voice sliced through the air. "Victoria." She knew who it was before she turned. Elias stood before her, expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something raw there, something that hadn't been present before. She didn't move, didn't blink. "Mr. Davenport." his lips pressed into a thin line at the formality. A word in private? Leonardo took a step closer to his mother, but Victoria placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's fine," she murmured before looking back at Elias. For a brief moment, silence stretched between them, a battlefield of unspoken words. Then, finally, she nodded. "Lead the way." Elias guided her through the crowd and out onto an empty balcony. The city stretched before them, a sea of golden lights flickering under the night sky. The cool air wrapped around them, but Victoria stood tall, unaffected. Elias turned to face her, his composure slipping. "Why didn't you tell me?" She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. Tell you? Tell you what, Elias? That I was left alone, pregnant, with nothing, that I worked 3 jobs while carrying your child, that I raised him alone because you walked away." His jaw tensed. "I didn't know. You didn't want to know." The words landed like a slap. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came. Victoria shook her head. "You made your choice, Elias, and it wasn't me. It wasn't him." "I was young," he muttered, raking a hand through his hair. "I was stupid." She laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "You were selfish. And now, 25 years later, you think you deserve an explanation, that you have a right to the life you abandoned." His chest rose and fell heavily. "He's my son." The word sent a chill through her, but she didn't let it show. "He's my son. I raised him. I fought for him." "He owes you nothing." Elias took a slow step closer. "I want to know him." Victoria met his gaze, steel in her voice. "Then you should have stayed." Silence. A deep, painful silence. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, he realized the truth. She would never forgive him. He had been erased from her life. Victoria turned toward the door. "Good night, Elias." And just like that, she was gone. Elias remained, standing in the cold, watching as the city lights blurred before him. He had lost. Leonardo watched his mother as they drove away from the gala, the city lights reflecting off the car's windows. She was quiet, staring out into the night, her expression unreadable. For years, he had known his mother as an unstoppable force, a woman who had shaped her own destiny through sheer determination. But tonight, for the first time, he saw something else: finality. The past had knocked on her door, demanding acknowledgement, and she had shut it without hesitation. He leaned back against the leather seat, letting the silence settle before finally speaking. "Are you okay?" Victoria turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I am." Leonardo studied her face carefully. "And Elias?" She sighed softly, shaking her head. "Elias is a man who made his choices, and tonight he realized the cost." Leonardo nodded. He'd seen it in the way Elias had looked at him, the regret, the weight of lost time pressing against him like an unbearable force, but it didn't change anything. He wasn't a child yearning for a father. He had never needed one. As the car moved through the city, Victoria reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You are my greatest victory," she murmured. Leonardo smiled. "And you are mine." At that moment, there was nothing left to be said. Victoria had lived in the shadow of the past for far too long, but tonight, for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Some doors weren't meant to be reopened, some wounds weren't meant to be healed, and some people were meant to be left behind. As their car disappeared into the night, Elias remained on the balcony of the gala, staring into the darkness, trapped in the prison of his own choices. What would you do in Victoria's place? Tell us in the comments. Give a like, subscribe and share, help us grow.